Hi, everybody. Welcome to module number 7, the anxiety disorders. I hope that you are having a great day and a great week this week. We are edging closer and closer and closer to being close to midterm in our class. Believe it or not, we're rolling right along. And so I want to say welcome to you and welcome to this module, the anxiety disorders. Now, I want to say a couple things to you about this module, module number 7 and module number 8. The module that you're going to study next week are the mood disorders. And sometimes students will say, Professor Killian, this Problems of Children and Adolescents class reminds me a lot of another class that I've taken in our program called Abnormal Behavior. So some of you may even be in that class with me right now, or you're taking it with another professor, you've already had it. And you know, in the Abnormal Behavior class, we talk more about adults and mental health conditions. And in this class, we're talking more about children and adolescents and not just mental health conditions. We've talked about developmental disabilities and behavior disorders and those kind of things. But here we are, the next two modules, this module and the next module, we are talking about really the idea of mental health and children and teens. So I think most of you probably understand this, but if not, let me highlight this. We do know that children and adolescents can and do exhibit the symptoms of what we call mental health problems or mental health conditions. A lot of times people think that mental health problems only relate to adults. They don't. We know that kids as young as 3 and 4 and 5 years old, it's not common, but we do see sometimes anxiety and depression or other kinds of issues that come into play, what we call more mental health kinds of struggles and conditions in early childhood sometimes, but certainly in middle childhood and definitely into adolescence. We oftentimes see kids struggling with mental health problems. That can look a bunch of different ways. But really, the two primary ways that we see kids struggling with mental health problems is the same two primary ways we see adults struggling with mental health problems, and that is with depression and anxiety. Depression and anxiety are two separate kinds of struggles that all of us are familiar with, but they are the two most common ways that we see mental health struggles across the age span: children, adolescents, adults. And so that is true for kids. And so for this class, we're focusing on kids. So in this module, we're talking about anxiety disorders or anxiety in kids. Whenever we use the word anxiety, we often have some other words that we kind of associate with anxiety, words like stress or fear or panic or worry. In some ways, all of those words have different definitions, sort of, but generally, they all kind of fall under the larger umbrella of anxiety. So, anxiety is just this emotional experience of being afraid or being worried or being frightened or panicked over something. And oftentimes our anxiety has both cognitive elements, the way it affects it's an emotion that affects how we think. And of course, it also is an emotion that affects how we act. And we see kids oftentimes struggling with anxiety. So in this module, we summarize, the textbook authors summarize some of the common ways that we see anxiety affecting children and adolescents. Now, here's kind of the tricky thing. I said this when we talked about ADHD. I said this last time we talked about behavior disorders. I'm going to say it again with anxiety. Here's kind of the tricky thing with kids and anxiety. If you remember being a kid, let me ask you, when you were a teenager or a child, did you have anything you were afraid of? I mean, I did. I mean, it's pretty typical. I mean, I wasn't probably like most of you. I would not consider myself like an over anxious child. But when I went through a spell in my life when I was a kid where I was afraid of the dark, and then I went through a spell where I was afraid of loud noises or whatever. I outgrew all of that as I got into adolescence and into adulthood. But we know that developmentally, kids are learning how to trust the world and trust people around them who care for them. And the world can be, for a child and a teenager, even for an adult, kind of a scary place sometimes. So anxiety and fear and worry and panic is a little bit normal to an extent for most kids. It's just somewhat developmentally. I have two children. They're both now in their 20s. Both of my kids, when they were young, went through periods where they kind of had either nightmares or they had things they were afraid of. In almost every situation, they outgrew all of that. But it was somewhat typical to childhood. And I know as a parent, I just kind of chalked it up to, so it's kind of just a phase they're going through. And luckily it was. So anxiety disorders, when it comes to kids and teenagers, is kind of tricky because, again, it's somewhat typical for all kids developmentally. Again, they're learning psychologically and emotionally and cognitively as their brains develop and as they mature how to trust the world, how to reconcile psychologically the idea that we do live in a world that can be dangerous at times. And so some fear and anxiety, as we always say in a lot of our classes, is somewhat healthy. It's not always a negative, unhealthy thing for us. And so that's true even for us as adults. But we do know, just as is the case with adults, some of you have been with me in my abnormal class, and we talk about this in that class, that there are times when people, in this case, we'll say children and adolescents, do struggle with anxiety kind of on a level that is outside the realm of typical. And there are these 3 Ds that we look at. I've already mentioned this, I think, already in this class. So, for example, the 3 Ds we look at that kind of help us to understand when kind of a typical everyday problem becomes more like a disorder or something that maybe needs treatment is the D of distressing. Is it has the problem risen to the level that now I am worried about myself or I'm worried about someone else. So in this case, with a child or adolescent, is there anxiety and worry and fear? Is it strong enough, intense enough that it has become something that we're worried about? It is distressing to the individual or to people around the other individual. Second D is a big one. It is the word disruptive. In this case, is the anxiety, is the worry, is the fear so strong and persistent and consistent that now it has become disruptive? It is affecting the child or teenager's ability to make friends, to go to school, to be successful in school. Is it affecting their appetite? Is it affecting their ability to just be a normal, typical kiddo? And so this idea of being disruptive. So distressing, disruptive, and the third D is the word detour. So if you're driving down the road and you come to a detour is where you have to go around something because the way you want to go is blocked, so to speak. So the word detour in this context just means, is the problem that we're seeing in any individual, in this case, is the anxiety problem we're seeing in a teenager or a child, is it a detour? Is it different from what we would expect or what would be common or what would be typical, either for the child or the teenager themselves, or just for the average typical 13-year-old or 9-year-old or whatever it may be. So we have to kind of use our common sense and our objective assessment, a little bit sometimes, to try to determine whether or not a problem that we're seeing is kind of typical or normal, or if it's kind of a detour, if it kind of is outside the realm of what we would consider typical, average, normal, or expected. So that's really important. We're going to come back to those 3Ds again next week when we talk about depression, because again, kids and teenagers especially, go through periods of being moody or down or blue or depressed. And so that's not necessarily something that we're overly concerned about. We get more concerned when a child or a teenager, an adult too, when their anxiety or their depression is disruptive, it is distressing, and it's a detour from what we would consider typical or normal for them or for someone else. So that's kind of what we're talking about here in this section. So one of the things that I want to highlight for you is, again, I'm not going to go through and review all these. I list for you, and your textbook does as well, 5 or 6 common actual identifiable anxiety disorders and how they relate to children. So again, if you've already had your abnormal behavior class, you might be familiar with some of these terms like social anxiety disorder or social phobia, obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a phobia, like what we call a specific phobia. All of those different terms that we use. I also list for you a separation anxiety disorder and school refusal, because those are 2 that are specific to children and adolescents. We don't see as much separation anxiety and school refusal in adults, right? But those are 2 specific kind of anxiety disorders that really relate specifically to kids. School refusal is kind of like school phobia. It really is. We could call it school phobia. We call it school refusal. Maybe you've had that experience or you've known a child. My wife for many, many years was a 5th and 6th grade teacher. And usually about every other year, even at that age, 5th and 6th grades, 10 and 11-year-olds, she would tell me a story of a kiddo at the beginning of the school year who would have this anxiety about either being separated from home or from mom and dad, separation anxiety disorder, or this idea of just being afraid of being at school, and so therefore refusing to come to school, having all kind of stomach aches and anxiety or whatever. And so we call school refusal. And so it's somewhat typical. We see a lot of that in kids and adolescents. So a lot of that you probably already know, but I give you some information on the module this week about those different disorders. So go through and review those. A lot of that may be review for you, but for some of you, it may be brand new. And your authors of the textbook also give us lots of good information, lots of good research and details on all those different disorders. So look at that as well, too. I'm not going to summarize each one of them for you here because I think you get all that information in the module this week. And then the last thing is this. An important thing to look at, we mentioned this last week when we talked about behavior disorders, and it's just this. Not only is it important to take into account the 3 Ds when it comes to anxiety in children and adolescents, it's also always important to realize that we need to always look at context. The context is always important when it comes to children and adolescents when they're struggling. Again, what does that mean? Context just means environment. And so, again, we know that one of the things we look for example, is if a child doesn't want to go to school, is it possible they're being bullied at school? So we have to look at that. Is it possible that the reason why a child has all these fears is because of maybe stress or dysfunction or chaos in the home? Maybe they're being abused. Maybe they're being threatened. Maybe mom and dad or guardians aren't getting along well with one another. They feel unsafe at home, psychologically or physically or emotionally. And you know that kids will sometimes begin to act that out sometimes. And so, again, we always have to look at the context even with adults, but especially with children and adolescents, especially when we see depression and anxiety, this idea of looking at kind of the context. Really, technically, an anxiety disorder in a child or adolescence, it really exists when we've ruled out all the other stuff. We've ruled out bullying, we've ruled out family instability, we've ruled out trauma, we've ruled out, all of that. And still, kids have obsessive compulsive tendencies, or they have unusual fears of things, and they won't go to school, or they won't separate from a caregiver, or whatever it may be. So that what we call an anxiety disorder. So anxiety disorders are very, very important. Lastly, I'm just going to mention this. Again, a couple more things. Number one of the things that's interesting about anxiety disorders in kids, and I mentioned this a minute ago, is that it's not uncommon at all for kids to struggle with some of these anxiety problems in childhood or adolescence and then grow out of them in adulthood. Now, that does not always happen. Many adults who struggle with anxiety today, OCD, generalized anxiety, panic attacks, when you talk to them and say, hey, when did you really start noticing that you have all this anxiety going on in your life? Many adults say, well, when I was a kid or when I was a teenager. So a lot of times anxiety problems do persist into adulthood. But we also see a lot of times where as kids get older and mature, that a lot of times they kind of work out or work through a lot of these anxiety problems and it kind of goes away. You'd be amazed how many stable adults today, when they were kids, were over anxious, afraid, wouldn't go to school, had all this kind of separation anxiety, maybe some OCD, kinds of things. That's not uncommon at all either as well too. Lastly, I was going to mention this. One of the things I had at school, I have a friend of mine who is a supervisor in a large school district here locally in the North Houston area. She's a supervisor over the counseling department for her school district. So she has all kinds of school counselors, special ed and general ed counselors who work underneath her. About 2 years ago, she and I we were seated next to each other in a meeting in October about this time of the year, and the school year had just begun. And I said, hey, how are the kids in your school district doing? And she said, Glenn, she said, it's amazing to me how many kids, she said, in the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen like a really dramatic increase in the number of kids with anxiety. She said, substance abuse has always been around. She said depression and suicide has kind of always been around. She said we see an increase in that, but she said we are dealing with more and more anxiety. And she said, like third graders who will not come to school, and fourth graders who are having panic and anxiety attacks, and sixth graders who suddenly are afraid of going out into the playground and won't socialize. All these kinds of anxiety kinds of issues that we're seeing in kids. Now, there's all kinds of theories about why we're seeing that today. We do live in a world that is can be kind of threatening to kids, but also too, I think this is my own personal theory. I think with the use of technology, we're more disconnected today. We have less and less individual relationship connections, and I think naturally that produces anxiety in us and in people. That's just my own personal theory. But anxiety disorders, all that to say, the anxiety disorders are really, really important. If you're interested in working with kids and families, or if you're just interested in kids, like child psychology in general, understanding the anxiety disorders and how they affect children is really, really important. So this little video just summarizes all that for you. Look at your lecture notes, do your discussion question, do your homework. Come back for module number 8 next week, and we'll talk about similar kind of ideas. We'll talk about depression, mood disorders, depression and bipolar disorder, and how it affects children and adolescents. I will see you next time. Have a good week.